So this is going to be a recorded space. My thinking is it'll be available for anyone who wants to listen to it later, or I'll leave it up if it ends up being an okay one, and they'll also upload it to YouTube. I thought what I would do, rather than just throwing up a video on YouTube without, I rarely get too much feedback, and I guess this would be something where I want to, after I speak, maybe open up if anyone wants to come up and either ask questions or comments or anything like that. In terms of what's been going on, and I guess it's sort of become more obvious to everyone in the last few weeks that we have this thing going on right now with the E6s that are either flying dark or using these fake hex codes. And I'm seeing a lot of posts speculating that it has to do the deployment of, the B2s and the, I can't remember the numbers of the refuelers and so on. But obviously there's a contingent of, assets that matter over at Diego Garcia. And people are seeing this happening at the same time as the strange stuff going on with the E6s. And there's a lot of, some speculation is fine, but I'm seeing a lot of people just outright saying that it must be related. And depending on who shows up, I mean, my question would be, is there actually a really good reason to believe that? Because the stuff I'm looking at in terms of the HFGCS traffic and the fact that over the last few months, not the last few weeks, it's starting to become notably more difficult to be able to easily identify, this EAM is broadcasting right now. I know this E6 just took off, in the last hour or two, and it kind of stands to rights that presumably this E6 is broadcasting that message. Well, if they're not even showing up on the flight radars and I have more messages than planes, then I don't really know what's going on. And this isn't something that just started the last few weeks. This is something that started, as I mentioned, in January. And also what happened in January was they began broadcasting 274 messages. And some of you aren't too familiar with that, but I'll do a quick recap in a moment. But that was also not really normal for them to be doing. And you might remember back in early February, I posted a video to YouTube saying these might be Sky King messages, and people got really excited and said, oh my god, Sky King is back. And I said, oh no, never mind, they've said they're 274 messages, and then everyone stopped paying attention because I guess there wasn't anything else going on. I mean, somewhat the thing that I'm driving at here is something I've said many times, which is that correlation does not equal causation. But let me just start with the heavy stuff first, and then we can kind of get into the softer philosophy and blah blah blah, and then we'll open it up for I guess people's questions. And I'll rewind just to no particular point last year, but as some of you guys know, I've become really interested, up until recently, in Skymaster events, which were not really well documented online. They seem to be occurring on a routine schedule that I was surprised nobody else had identified and published or posted about, really. And these are really interesting because you'll have, there are days where people will get excited because there were 30 AMs. And I'm like, okay, that's not that really remarkable if you monitor them long enough. Skymaster events, some of them will have 100 plus EAMs in a single day. You'll have a bunch of E6s in the air simultaneously. You hear all kinds of crazy stuff. And one of the things that you hear them broadcast are 274 messages. And I thought those are really weird because they sound quite different from EAMs. There's pretty much a standard format to emergency action messages that you learn to recognize, and it's fairly mundane. They're 30 characters unless they're less or specified otherwise. And you hear them, you're like, okay, that's an EAM, or maybe it's an FDM. That's kind of a sidebar. The 274 messages are really, I thought, quite bizarre. And looking into them, I started to try and distinguish, well, are these something that is known as a nuclear execution report, which sounds rather, intense, and in the context of Skymaster events, which I've taken to understand, and I've seen other people speculate on this as most likely being practicing, the opening salvos of conflict with, a pure adversary, or in so many words, they're practicing World War III, maybe. That's really exciting to hear and record, and I've posted some of those up on the Neat Intel YouTube channel for you to listen to. But as far as my understanding had been to that point, it seemed like 274 messages were really a special hallmark of Skymaster events, and not really something you would expect to hear on the HFGCS otherwise. What exactly are 274 messages? What exactly is a nuclear execution report? You get lost in PDFs or text files profiles of things across the years. And there's some answers, some information out there. And one of the things I'll be talking about here is I've just really grown to be very skeptical of the information I come across nowadays, because I feel like there's still a habit of stating speculation as fact and not really adequately making a distinction between what you know and what you're assuming. So what happened, if you guys remember, was it October or November of last year? And this I think is kind of a good point to start from. When Russia did that test launch of they called it test launch. I know some of you will take umbrage at that terminology, but that's what it was characterized with the IRBM, the Oreshnik, whatever it was, that they fired against Ukraine. And around that time, we heard, was it E6s or was it bombers? I can't recall. Either way, we heard nuclear execution report on the exact same day as that happened. I think a few hours after. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's quite interesting. But at the time, I didn't say that those nuclear execution broadcasts were necessarily associated with that, because the fact is there had been broadcasts of those reports the day before and the day after, and I think a couple days after again. But the point of contention here would be, well, if I'm going to say that I'm just going to pick out random numbers. If you want to know the exact dates, it can be found on the YouTube channel. If I'm going to say the nuclear execution reports that were broadcast on, say, November 11th necessarily corresponded to the Oreshnik test launch on that same date, then I'm potentially claiming that the United States of America knew about that missile launch ahead of time, because they broadcast nuclear execution reports the day before, and I held back on that. Now, let me be clear. I'm really thrown off by that thing still right now. It feels really difficult to dismiss as a coincidence. And I've made this point with Skymaster events and anything. Try and pick a day in the last few years, or really any point. It's difficult to think of a point in world history where the US could have a major military exercise and someone clueless couldn't just look at this and say, oh, that must be related to that. We know a lot of people on YouTube who do this right now. They'll say, oh, I heard a EAM. It relates to what's going on in Iran or Israel or Russia or this or that. And you guys have heard me give this spiel before. In so few words, correlation does not equal causation. And I guess that would be the most recent example that I would think is of regard. So let's skip ahead and start talking about the current situation, which I would argue to you more or less started in January, or maybe a few months earlier to that. But I know it got to a point where in January, as mentioned, there were more EAM broadcasts than there were E6s showing up on flight radars. And I put together looks like it's only a 9-minute video. I had a nice little AI voice go through a few examples for you guys, showing how I usually correlate an EAM to an E6. Most typically, it's on the basis of timestamp. So what will usually happen, the HFGCS will broadcast an EAM, and then the E6s will repeat it. And if the E6 is on the East Coast of the United States, it's over the Atlantic, it's going to typically, not always, but typically broadcast those on the 10s and the 40s. So, 810, 840, 910, 940, sometimes less than 4 times, in rare instances more than 4 times. But there was enough times where I saw that, and that appeared to be a reasonable conclusion. There were also enough times where on the West Coast, the timestamps there are the 20s and the 50s, and in the Gulf of America, it's on the top and the bottom of the hour. And that's a little bit on its own sort of not super definitive, but what helps is then there are enough people saying, I was listening on 311 megahertz, which needs to be a line of sight, and I heard the same call sign broadcasting the same message, and that allows me to say, okay, this isn't just speculation based on time. We can now prove with something more definitive. That started falling apart. I believe it was maybe late last year, October, November, December. But like I said, I really started noticing it in January. I think I was taking a break from active transcription in the later half of 2024. But I tried again in January. I'm like, wow, this is really getting quite messy. There are more than enough instances where we're hearing EAMs from an E6, but nothing is showing up on the flight radars. There's no E6 visible. Now, some of you guys will know I'm occasionally able to figure out an E6 on the basis of its noises. So some of them will have like these characteristic whines or squeals or patterns of distortion. And if you look up posts I've made on X in the past, type of hex code, and then do from : neat intel. I think alpha echo 04 Echo is one of them. There's some others. You can find them if you're interested. Sometimes I luck out and I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is that. And I'm able to say, even though it's not showing up on the flight radars, it was probably that guy broadcasting that EAM. And you'll luck out every now and again. I don't usually go live with that right away. I wait and see, because sometimes those planes end up appearing on the radars after all. I'm like, yep, I was right. That's what kind of gives me confidence to say those sorts of things. Otherwise, I'm a very pedantic guy. Some of you may have noticed this. Some of you may have even been subject to it. I'm like, no, I'm not convinced. That's not sufficiently compelling. I'm a very I look for those sorts, I guess, details. And in January, I had some hits, but mostly misses where I'm like, I don't know what E6 this is, and I'm not sure how you figure it out. And around the same time, they began broadcasting those 274 messages, which is not completely new. Did a video in February, that one I mentioned, where I said these are maybe Sky King messages, and I talked about looking through some old databases, and there are instances of what would appear to be an E6 just broadcasting 274 messages, not, as far as I could tell, related to a Skymaster event or anything, just kind of, hey, we're doing this now. But at least as far as what's documented, this would now be success. And it looks like it's been graduating. It's always possible we were missing broadcasts. February, it was sort of, one or two here or there over the month. And from Null / Paulus, who has, he transcribes them. I wish I would keep recordings, but I guess it's better than nothing for now. It was sort of continuing through March, and I've picked up right now these last few days of April, and it looks like there's been 3 or 4 a day these last few days. I think today I didn't have a chance to go through all the recordings, but I noted at least 2, 4 yesterday, 2 on the 6th, 3 or 4 on the 5th. This is a lot, and I wouldn't be really sure why they're doing this process. And I guess this is where I can kind of start to editorialize a little bit. My point of consternation is kind of figuring out, well, where exactly do you go with this from here? I've got it up on the Jumbotron right now. A chart of just the last few days, the 274 messages from the E6s I've been talking about. These are clearly not one-time pad messages, which is funny because like a lot of stuff online, when I look up what people have talked about regarding 274 messages and documentation thereof over the years, everyone says, oh, 274 messages are one-time pad coded, can't be broken, da 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 da. Clearly that's not correct, but there's only so much to say there. So Null has done a little bit on this, Null / Paulus, and someone actually replied to me today with the same information. These are called operations codes. And this is another point where someone replied to me today and they said, these are operations codes. They last about 30 days, no more than 30 days, and then they have to cycle through them. And actually, if you look at, I don't have them on the Jumbotron right now, but if you look at the ones that were documented throughout February into March, it actually looked like they were quarterly, because I see really similar character sets in messages broadcast February 2nd, 3rd, and then I mentioned some on March 23rd, and you see these groups of characters again, really similar to what's on the Jumbotron right now, just for April, where you look at this and you can tell, well, if this is one-time coded, they're not doing it correctly. Doesn't seem very secure. So it would make more sense to say that's not what it is. Another thing that I want to put up here that I don't have, we don't know the actual E6s broadcasting any of these. So I'll put the full chart up at some point. Maybe I'll do this right now. For 3 of the messages that I've got right now, I have like their, in air quotes, fake hex codes. And that's, I think, the next thing I want to talk about here. This idea of the fake hex codes and why they might be doing this now. But as I understand it, everyone has come to the conclusion that it's not really possible to figure out which plane is which of these hex codes, that they're completely dynamic, and it's impossible to figure them out. I think you guys have already solved at least 1 or 2 instances where, going off the ACARs, you sort of make educated guesses along the exact same lines of what I just described earlier, where you have a suspicion, then if you get an opportunity to test that theory, and it looks like it's a replicatable set of rationale, then that works. So I don't know if we've absolutely come to the conclusion that they can't be figured out. I think there's at least a few instances where that's already been done. Give me a second here. I'm just putting this up on the Jumbotron. You'll have to zoom in to look at that, but if you grab the picture, you'll see for April 6th, and April 7th, I think someone noted like another one, but those are the ones that I have so far. And those are not like their regular or real, and I'm using air quotes here, hex codes. So some of you guys know for February, late February into March, I said I'm going to try and like monitor some other stuff. I wanted to see, because I felt like it was a gap in the data set. What does it usually sound like on some of the Mars frequencies? How active are some of the Stratcom frequencies, even when we're not paying attention to them normally? And also tried to capture some activity from Wolfhound, aka Ramstein Air Base in Europe overnight. And that one didn't quite come out the way I hoped, but I captured some other stuff. But as far as like regular HFGCS NAT monitoring, there are a few reasons I've talked about in the past when like, I feel like we need to give these SDRs a break, basically. So around the time these E6s started going dark, I guess what I'm trying to get at, had I been monitoring, I'm pretty sure I would have been able to figure out, using a similar rationale as I've described before, which hex is which E6. Now, some people have said these are completely dynamic hex codes. I would soft push back against that. I'll throw something up on the Jumbotron right now. So they're not completely dynamic as far as I can tell. I didn't look through all of them. I haven't found a list of all of these hex codes that have been documented so far. But of the two that I looked at, AF0930, you see there, it was in use April 2nd going into the 3rd. That was like a single flight that just crossed the day boundary. And then a few days later, it's used again on April 5th. AF05D9 was used April 2nd, and then a few days later, you see it used again for April 6th into April 7th. Now, it's absolutely a fair question to say, okay, we'll use the one I just listed off, AF05D9. That a plane flew with that hex on the 2nd, and that was flying about Tinker. And then on April 6th and 7th, it was used again, but that was a plane that was flying about Travis. Where is the flight where this thing goes from Tinker to Travis? Or rather, wouldn't it make more sense? Wouldn't it be easier to say, actually, these are two different planes? My question would be, and this goes out to anyone, this is something I've always felt like is kind of a weakness. The data is all out there, or a lot of data is out there, but you're kind of like bouncing around on X. I bounce around on forums sometimes when I'm interested in instances like this. I'll do some digging to figure out what's going on. There's no like nice single central repository that seems to serve this specific question. ADSB Exchange or any other thing, you can kind of step through the planes day by day, but unless there's something I'm overlooking, you're stepping through based on certain hex codes. So we've seen at least a few instances where these things are using these random hex codes that, unless you know to type in advance, it's not going to pull up. Like I found these two because you're able to find them by filtering for type E6 and then type description L4J. But there have also been some planes where I've seen people say this was probably an E6, and you type that hex code in, and the type is, not defined. It just shows up as a question mark. The type description is also a question mark. So if that's possible, if they're doing that, I don't know how you figure that out or how you find that. But I don't actually buy that it can't be done. It's just a question of time. Something I've had to, as an individual, kind of come to a conclusion in the last few months is I'm not going to be able to put anywhere near as much time into this as I used to. I started working on this last night, and I'm like, I can't afford this much time for this kind of thing anymore. If no one else has, put that together, that's okay. Ultimately, this is a hobby for people, right? I'm no one's boss. I can't chastise someone like, why doesn't this exist? Why doesn't this exist? But it's a little bit frustrating, I think. And I've given a few examples over the last couple months in some recent videos, even really small stuff. Sometimes there are these, dial tones. They sound like dial tones on the HFGCS. And I've seen everyone across, all kinds of forums, email chains, X, they'll call them DTMF or dual tone modulation frequency. And there was something last year or maybe early this year where there was a series of 5 or 6 or 7 tones. I'm like, oh my goodness, I think they're dialing a phone number. And the wonder of DTMF is you can pretty much look at the spectrum in, any spectrum visualizer and figure out the number they dialed. And I looked at it in the visualizer, and this was not DTMF, because each tone was actually made up of 3 or 4 tones rather than 2. And you kind of say, well, what's the consequence there? I'm just using it as an example to say there's so many things that people say that aren't Exactly true. And I feel like we're kind of at this right now. I'm not convinced that what we're seeing right now over the continental US with the E6s is absolutely related to what's going on in Diego Garcia. Because I think it's a larger claim that would say, well, the E6s have been building up towards this for the last few months. And you can make that claim, actually. I'm not saying that's impossible. This can be a slow-moving machine that implements this in phases. But the way that it's presented online is, while the E6 has just started doing this, the last few weeks, now we know things are going to Diego Garcia. Obviously, the two are connected. I'm like, well, if that's going to be the approach, then there's kind of no point in transcribing the 274 messages or publishing them, because those would paint into a story that says, well, the activity with the E6 didn't just start like 2 weeks ago. This has been a slow boil for a few months now. So if there's someone who's able to comment on that and say that would or wouldn't rule it out, I'm not that guy, clearly. But I get a little flustered and annoyed when there's certain things that are just kind of taken for granted. The thing is here, it's like, well, what exactly, neat intel do you think would have to be done here to figure this out? And it's like, realistically, it would probably be a pretty large scale endeavor. Like, you would need people who live near these Air Force bases. You could kind of say, hey, how many things did you know? E6s did you observe taking off today? And then trying to correlate that to, this new traffic. And you could probably reverse engineer which of these hex codes was which E6 and do that. But that's a pretty big ask. And again, it's like, this is for most people a hobby. If someone has that kind of time, that's great. But if they don't, that's fine. But there are these little bits of data where it could be resolved another method. It's just who has the time and the initiative for that. And I've looked at on forums, and I just see a lot of people just jumping to the quickest and easiest solution, which is to say these hex codes can't be solved. It absolutely relates to Diego Garcia. And I'm like, okay, I don't know. But I guess what I would put to the audience that's listening right now would be the idea, I think there's opportunities there. With the most recent thing on the Jumbotron, you have these gaps between these hex code uses. If someone were to pull together over the last few weeks, which hexes were used on which days, where they were, and try and correspond that to which E6s were at which bases at which times from the hex codes that we know about, or the registration numbers, obviously, you probably could figure this out. And then again, I guess to get a little bit philosophical, it's like, well, okay, now you know the hex codes and which plane is which. Where does that get you? The answer is, I don't really know. I guess if you're interested in this stuff, you're interested in figuring that out. And that's the period end of, insofar as that goes. We're at the half-hour mark. I didn't visualize this being particularly long a space. And I know there's another space right now with the Intel Frog. So I'm happy to leave my comments at that point and put it to you guys in terms of any questions or comments or anything as far as anything I've discussed.